Francis Drake, and of course, before that, I can't believe it's totally unforgivable of me that I forgot last week to tell you how you remember the fate of all the wives of Henry VIII. Some of you may know this. There's a rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. How many of you have heard that one?
No.
So, I know it's technically, there was no divorces, but it sounds better than annulled, beheaded. Good morning. Bonjour. I'll work on my French. So, the other thing that's going to relate for today's lecture, I mentioned last week that Henry VIII began or was the initiator of the British Navy. He's the one who pretty much got that all started. He's also the one who popularized and maybe even invented the broadside. Back in Henry VIII's day, most ships did not have a lot of cannons on them. He was the one who decided that his ships are going to be loaded with cannons. And that was going to be the new style of warfare. It took a long time really to catch on. And as we get into today's lecture, we'll see this, they learned their lesson. And from this point on, naval warfare is going to include a lot more cannons and broadsides rather than trying to come up next to a ship and board it. So, Sir Francis Drake, possibly the greatest mariner that Great Britain ever produced. And we will start with the bibliography. This first one, if you want a short read, it's entertaining enough. Christopher Lloyd, Sir Francis Drake. It's pretty good. If you're a real stickler on being historically precise and accurate, this wouldn't be the book for you, but it's close enough. R.K. Andrews is a better historically accurate book, a little bit longer, Drake's Voyages. And then a couple on the Spanish Armada, which of course made one of the things that made Drake famous. Michael Lewis, this is the shorter version of the Spanish Armada. It's an interesting read to read this guy. This was back in 1960. And this guy is very patriotic. So when he refers to the British, it's our ships and our men. When he refers to the Spanish, he's talking about the enemy. And he's very open about this. He tries to be even-handed and mentions the pluses and minuses, the virtues and vices, the good, the bad, and the indifferent on both sides. But he is clearly a partisan of the British, and being British himself. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting to read a book like this where the guy talks about the Spanish as the enemy, when we approached the enemy and they did this or that. A very good read, Garrett Mattingly, The Armada 400th Anniversary Edition. I would recommend this, a little bit longer, but a very good read, covering in depth that whole episode. So let's get into the, you need a handout.
Oh, thank you. Sorry to be late.
That's okay.
Blame my doctor. Always blame the doctor.
Do you have a tardy sleep? So at this time in Elizabethan England, England was a pretty much a second-rate power, a respected second-rate power, but second-rate nonetheless. It was Spain that was the superpower of the day. They owned a lot of territories throughout the world, not just in the New World, but in the East Indies and the West Indies, and they were a powerhouse. The treasures that they were bringing back from the New World were immense. Nothing like it has ever been seen before. And so they had built up their navies, and they were very powerful. They also ran territories in the Low Countries, and which was very concerning for Great Britain at the time, because a lot of markets for British woolen goods were from the Low Countries, and so they had a very important economic interest on what went on across the strait there. So, also, of course, Great Britain is very jealous of all of these riches that are coming across from the New World, as everyone was. And so they had their eyes on those. Sir Francis Drake, born 1543, he was a very devout Protestant. He was raised in a devout Protestant home, and they lived through Queen Mary's Protestant persecutions, which probably made them even more adamantly Protestant. He was a cousin of John Hawkins, who also became a well-renowned mariner, and probably at this period of time, John Hawkins is second only to Drake in his fame and glory. On one of Drake's first voyages as a man in his 20s, he converted a Catholic Welshman along the trip, and we know this because the Catholic Welshman was later captured by the Spanish and was convinced of the error of his ways by the Spanish Inquisition. So sadly, he probably ended up a galley slave the rest of his days. So his first voyages, Drake was on with John Hawkins, and they were slavers. They would go to the coast of Africa, Guinea coast, and gather slaves, probably buy them from the local chieftains, and take them to the New World to sell them. Now, the problem that they had was that this was not a legal thing to do according to the Spanish Empire. Spain wanted a monopoly on all of the trade goods that they had, including slaves. And so it was not legal to go to Spain to sell slaves. So what they would do, with a wink and a nod, they'd show up, and the local governor of any town, they would say, look, you want to buy slaves, we want to sell slaves. So we're going to threaten you. We'll shoot a few cannonballs here and there, and then you're going to give in. And the governor would say, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And they did. And this is the kind of trade that went on until Spain started cracking down, and they got a governor that was not going to do that sort of thing. So they had to put up a real offensive action and shoot and defeat the town, and then sell the slaves. Only the governor at this one point tricked them and ambushed, and they barely got away with their lives. There was a number of ships that were taken, so there weren't enough ships to haul all of the men who were involved, so they dropped them off on the Mexican coast, and these 100 men, we find out later, were taken by the Spanish Inquisition and mostly either hung, burned at the stake, or became galley slaves. And then Drake became a captain. He was well known as a very good leader, so it was not difficult at all to see him as a captain. So he became someone who would raid the Spanish coast, Spanish towns in South America, and made a name for himself. He certainly wasn't the only one. The British were doing this sort of thing because it was a good way to punish your enemies, because Spain was the enemy. You might compare this to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was not open warfare necessarily, but you know that they are the bad guys. And the British, from the Spanish point of view, were the heretics because they were Protestant. And so this went on for many years. As I say, it was the Cold War of the day. And so all is fair when you're going against the bad guys, the Spanish, who are the Antichrist, along with the head Antichrist as the Pope. So on one of his particular outings, he came across this town, and he was a great tactician, by the way. And he would usually use this two-pronged approach where he would, with his ships, go into the harbor. He had already dropped off a number of men, a few hundred or maybe 1,000 or so, and the men would come by land. He would bring his ships by sea and attack from two different directions, and usually the town would give in just a few hours, so it was done with quickly. And on one in particular, he captures the town, only he was wounded in the leg. He was shot and he was bleeding, but he didn't want to stop it at that point, and they reached the treasure trove of silver that this one town had collected, and it was immense. It was 10 feet wide, 12 feet tall, and 70 feet long, they said. And just as they were about to gather this together and put it on the ships, Drake passes out from loss of blood, and there was a torrential downpour ruining the roads. So Drake, in his half-conscious state, is telling his men, "Don't worry about me, gather the silver." But they picked Drake up and took him to the ships and just left at that point, and left all this silver behind. But they hadn't given up. He was going to go to ambush one of the treasure mule trains gathering the treasure from Peru. In Panama, they had a whole system of collecting the treasure from Peru, bringing it up to Panama, and bringing it across the isthmus at that point, and then sending it off to Spain. And so the first time they did it, it was just about to work. They had this ambush ready along the trail, and they had a signal ready to all jump up and attack. And unfortunately, one of Drake's men was absolutely drunk and really didn't get the whole signal thing. He jumped up way too early, made a noise, and they were warned, and so they couldn't get the mule train at that point. They tried again later on and were successful, but they couldn't carry all the treasure because once again some knucklehead allowed some of the Spanish to escape, and they went to warn the soldiers in town, and so they could only gather up a certain amount of treasure. They buried the rest and took off with what they had. When they came back, they found that the Spanish had already found that treasure because of another knucklehead who was drunk, who was captured by the Spanish, and they tortured him until he told them where the treasure was. Anyway, one of the other very hazardous things about going to the New World are the fevers. that the British just were not used to, and many men start dying after a few weeks there in the tropics. And it was not, by the way, malaria. Malaria is not native to the New World. Malaria comes from Africa, and it had not penetrated quite that much at this time. There were other fevers, of course. There's cholera, yellow fever that the men were getting. So they had to, before too long, get back. But he returned to Hero, not just because he was gathered some treasure, but he had socked it to the Spanish, and that's always a good thing to do in Elizabethan England. So here's a mule train. I was just looking for some sort of photos, give you an idea of what it's like on a mule train. So one of the things that Drake is most famous for is his circumnavigation of the world. His was not the first, of course. We know that Magellan did it many years earlier, but he was the first captain to go all the way around the world because, as we know, Magellan died in the Philippines getting involved in some ridiculous warfare between various Filipino tribes. So he set out to raid the coast of Peru. That was the initial goal. Peru, on the western side of South America, you know you have to go around the Straits of Magellan to get there. And no one had ever done it, not to raid anyway. And the only one who had done it was Magellan many, many years prior to this. So he sets out to do this, knowing that no one is going to expect it. There are no defenses on the towns along the western coast of South America. It's going to be easy pickings. He started out with 5 vessels, 3 larger ones and 2 smaller ones. The smaller ones, and a lot of this, for me, in learning all this, it's a whole new vocabulary because you have to learn nautical terms, which can be very different from the vocabulary that you're used to. And so you have galleys, galleons, and galleasses, and you have pinnaces. Am I saying that right? Does anybody know these better than I do? There are pinnaces. So if I'm mispronouncing, it's perfectly okay then, huh? Yeah. The pinnaces are the smaller craft that can be a lot more maneuverable and faster. And some of them, they can be small enough to put on one of the larger vessels. So anyway, the first stop was the Cape Verde Islands. And along the way, if you are well armed, you can pretty much take whatever you want on the high seas because not many ships were well armed in those days. Most would have some weaponry. They'd have cannons and culverins, but if you were well armed, as Drake was, you would have your way with just about anybody you came across. And so, Cape Verde Islands, he takes some small ships, and he got a Portuguese man who was knowledgeable of the waters in the New World, and so he took him along as a pilot. Evidently, the guy actually wanted to go, so that was helpful too. And here's the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. How many of you are really good with geography? Or somewhat, at least. So, the Cape Verde Islands, they're south of the Canary Islands, which are off the coast of Spain somewhat. So he's heading towards South America, he landed just above the Platte River, which is the northern end of Argentina. It was called the Land of Demons because of the tribal people at the time were very unfriendly. And he was attacked. He and his men were attacked by a group of natives and actually killed one of his master gunners. And they shot a couple of the natives and killed them. And it's always remarkable to people of Europe to see these primitive native peoples who are painted and dressed up to look very scary, and they were, but they were not generally well respected, and so you shoot a few of your arquebuses. There's a term. How many of you know what that is? An arquebus. It is a primitive musket. Before you have the musket, you have the arquebus. And so the Platte River is right here, right around Buenos Aires, Argentina. And he landed in what is now Uruguay and then headed south along the coast. So one of the things about Drake that many people have noted is that his men generally loved him because he had the kind of charisma and he cared about his men very much, and he had the kind of charisma that endeared him to his men. And he was generally an upbeat, friendly sort of guy until you cross him. If you disagree with him, if you tell him that what he's doing is a mistake, he does not take it well. And so occasionally, from time to time, his officers would tell him, wait a second, this isn't right. We should be doing it this way instead of that way. And if they insisted on their point of view, they could be looking at a court-martial and an execution. And that's what happened with his former friend, one of the guys who actually helped him plan this whole round-the-world trip. Thomas Doughty was charged with mutiny because he disagreed with some of the plans that Drake had. And it didn't matter that he protested, that all he was doing was giving his advice, just in a very firm sort of manner. Drake, with his erstwhile friend, put him on trial, and as the judge himself, Drake sentenced him to death, because this is mutiny. This isn't just a disagreement, and I can't put up with this sort of thing. So he was sentenced to death, and oddly enough, for the next 48 hours between the sentencing and the execution, the two of them made up, had dinner together, and talked things out, and had a very friendly conversations together before Thomas was beheaded. Having dinner together, meals and stuff. And so after the beheading, then Drake lifts up his head and says, this is the way it's going to be with traitors. Entering the Straits. The Straits of Magellan, well known to be a very difficult naval operation. To get through that strait, and by the way, it is always bad weather in the southern tip of South America.
No, it isn't.
Huh?
It wasn't when I was there. No.
Oh, you were there. You caught me.
Same for me.
Really?
It was
Well,
about
I have
seven.
been misinformed.
But it's almost always bad.
Almost always. Okay, I have to clarify that. So you've been there too? Wow. So unfortunately for the men on this trip, they had planned so that they would go in the summertime. So when they get there in August, and it's very cold. They're thinking, wait a second, what's wrong here? It's summertime, isn't it? Well, no, they didn't get it. Summertime for the northern hemisphere is winter for the southern hemisphere, something that nobody really realized at the time. So the weather was not very good, but he made it through the strait really very quickly. It wasn't the strait that was so difficult, although aside from the weather, I understand it, and I know I'll be corrected here, but traveling through the strait can be a very difficult thing, at least maybe initially, when you don't know, when you have no charts. The shoals, the narrows, things like that can be a very difficult, very tricky operation for a naval navigator to make it through. Do I need to be corrected here? We good? Okay. So they made it through. Now I forgot to mention before they got there, Drake had let everybody know he's down to just 3 ships now. He let the pinnaces go. He's down to 3 ships, and he tells them, if you don't want to continue with me, I'm okay with that. I don't want you coming if you're afraid to get through this. I know this is going to be difficult. And no one took him up on the offer, so in they go, and they get through in record time. Of course, the only other person who did it was Magellan. Magellan took 38 days. Drake took 16 days. So it was a very well-done operation. The problem was not, as it turns out, getting through the straits. The problem was the horrible storms on the opposite side. Because once they reached the opposite side, there were gale force winds that were blowing and continued for over a month. Once they got there, one of the ships went down. All hands, everybody, it just went under the waves, and everybody was lost. Another one of the ships got to the other side. They had been separated in these storms, and decided that since they lost Drake, they have no idea what happened to him. They're going to turn around and go back. They waited a while. They waited a few weeks and didn't find him, so they went back. So now Drake, with his ship, by the way, he renames his ship at this point. It had been I think it was the Pelican, and he changed it to the Golden Hind. Famous ship at this point. He made it through, but he made another discovery. So he gets through the Straits of Magellan. You can see it can be a very complex maze getting through there. When you have no real charts, it could be very difficult. And this is one of the results of the dangers of the straits. Now, when you guys were going through, did you see any of these ships? Because I looked these up. I'm assuming that they get it right. Did you see any ships?
We didn't. We were on a working ferry going up through the islands, and I don't recall.
Okay.
But there was one spot where it was like maybe 20 feet on each side as our ferry
Wow,
went through.
wow.
It was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
By the way,
Yes.
in London, there's a really great replica of the Golden
Golden
Hind.
Hind. Can walk
It's
that way.
Yeah.
low at sea.
Uh-huh.
Just,
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be pretty neat to see.
Yeah.
So it's roughly 350 miles long. I was told that it was 1 mile wide at the narrowest. The shoals, the storms, twists and turns, and they say Magellan took 38 days, Drake was 16. Pretty amazing feat. Maybe luck had a lot to do with it. You never know with the weather and just sailors' luck sometimes. And of course, they couldn't understand the weather in August, why it would be so cold and stormy. And as I said, Drake's ship at this point is alone. The Marigold went down. The other one lost track of Drake and went home. And Drake makes a discovery. He's blown way south once he gets to the other side, and he discovered that there was a passage. They didn't know that there was anything else. No one had gone down to the very bottom of South America, so they may have assumed that it was land all the way through to the Arctic, the Antarctic.
See the map again?
And so he was blown all the way down and could see and patrolled around enough to know that that is a passageway. So that is what is now known as Drake's Passage. So after a month or so of this horrible storm, he starts going up north, and he finds it's very easy pickings. He has a particular method to what he does. He goes up, he only has one ship at this point, but it's very easy to pick up other ships along the way. Anything that he sees, he can take. And so he picks up a few ships along the way, and his method is by night. He goes up to some harbor, sees a ship that looks enticing, and sails up next to it, and they will hail him and ask, "Who is this? What is your business?" And he'll have somebody on board who can speak Spanish and tell them, "Oh, we are from Peru. This is such and such a ship." And everybody's okay until he pulls up alongside and they shoot off a few of their arquebuses and jump aboard and say, "We are now taking this ship." And it turns out Drake prided himself on being a gentleman. He was very courteous to those who surrendered quickly, especially the captains. So the captain would take him on board and wine and dine him and just be the perfect gentleman as his men plundered the ship. And oddly enough, many of the ship's captains who were taken really appreciated this. They understood this is the way things are out at sea, and when you are taken, you really appreciate a gentleman doing it. And there is a very interesting episode here where Drake captures a very nice, well-supplied ship, lots of really nice treasures, and he has a particularly nice conversation with the captain. And he tells the captain, "Look, I have another ship that's around somewhere. I don't know if they perished or if they're behind me somewhere, but I'm going to give you a letter to my companions who maybe you might run into them. And so I'm going to give you a letter." And this is what he put in the letter. The captain of the ship was Captain Winters. So, "Master Winter, if it pleaseth God that you should chance to meet with this ship of St. John de Anton, I pray you use him well according to my own word and promise given to him. And if you want anything that is in this ship, I pray you pay them double the value for it, for which I will satisfy again. And command your men not to do her any hurt, and what composition or agreement we have made, at my return to England, I will by God's help perform." So, very gentlemanly thing to do. And then he goes traveling up north to California, and he's seeking what many people wanted at that time was a Northwest Passage. A lot of the dreams of Britain at this time and other countries were to find a way to the east. they did not know if there was a way up north to do it. And so many explorers were in search of that. And Drake, being the first guy to really get to the opposite side up that far north, he was going to look for it too. He got up about as far as Vancouver before turning around and coming back. It was at this point that he really was making his decision whether to go around the world or not. The initial plan was really kind of open. It was not necessarily going to be a circumnavigation of the globe. It was something that he could do if he chose, and it's at this point that he chose to go around the world instead of coming back down. One of the reasons being that now that the Spanish knew he was there, if he went back down the same route, he would probably run into a number of ships that would not be very friendly, and he'd have a battle on his hands. So he went up probably around Vancouver. There's a lot of debate over how far he really got, and then came back down. We now have Drake's Bay. How many of you are familiar with California? Good. I'm a native Californian, so this is something I can speak knowledgeably about. So you have Drake's Bay right there at Point Reyes, which is a really pretty coastline. And it's at that point that he, for about a month, he stayed there and to refresh and refurbish. He's going to stick with his ship. And this was something interesting too. If you've gone on a long voyage in one of these ships, one of the things that you do is called careening, where you bring it up at high tide, and during low tide, it is somewhat beached, and it tilts on its side. At that point, you can repair better the ship's sides. And so this is a painting of Drake careening his ship. And then, one of the things that Drake says that he did at this point, he has a brass plate that he nails to a post along with a picture of Queen Elizabeth and a sixpence. And he, in his records, he says that he did this. And, for future generations. And so in 1936, somebody claimed that they found it and presented it to the world. And for a long time, historians were thinking that may be the real thing. It wasn't until somewhere around early 2000s before they could prove that it was a hoax with the metallurgy, that they could examine what it was made of and a lot more advanced techniques of deciphering these sorts of things. But for a long time, and if you read any history of the time that's written, say, before the 70s, they will tell you that it's still debated whether this was real or not. And at this point, he has to go across the Pacific. Takes 68 days, a very dangerous thing to do, and he knew it, and all of the sailors must have known too, that when you spend a lot of time on a ship, people start breaking out with scurvy and other diseases. A very scary thing. Drake, as it happens, though he didn't know any more than anybody else what causes scurvy, they knew that it had something to do with the lack of good food. And so Drake generally tried to prepare well for these voyages, and relatively few of his men got scurvy and died. He reached the Moluccas, and these are the Spice Islands. That this was the crowning feat for many adventurers of the day, if you could get to the Spice Islands and make it back, you can be rich. Magellan, with his trip around the world, despite the fact that almost everybody died, there was only one ship left, 17 men left on that ship, half dead. Yet, in that one ship, he had cloves, tons of cloves. And when the king found that this one last ship that survived with only 17 men still had tons of cloves, he was overjoyed, because that more than paid for the whole trip. Cloves of all things. And so,
Maybe the emperor had no clothes.
yeah, that's a good one. I'll have to remember that. Did you make that up? Very good, very good.
He's always.
The emperor has no clothes. That's a good one. Okay, I'm going to steal that from you. Okay? So, the Sultan of the island was a cheery sort of guy, but neither side trusted the other, and so they bought their cloves and then spent the next month or so on an island nearby, recuperating from the journey. And as I said, very few of the sailors died across this period of time. Here's the Drake meets the Sultan, and of course, Sultan, if you know he's a Sultan, you know he is what? He's Muslim. The Muslims had reached this area and were already trading, but there's always bad feelings between different partners in this game, you might say, and so it's not hard to come in as the friendly guy to undercut your competitors. And so that was the high point. The rest of it, for the most part, was not very difficult, except at one point they get stuck on some coral, a coral reef, and they really thought this was the end because they were stuck good. And they knew that if they couldn't get this ship off of the coral, they were going to die. They were out in the middle of nowhere. The chances of any other ship coming by were slim, and the chances of that ship coming by being friendly were even slimmer. So they had to jettison several tons of supplies. 3 tons of cloves, they got rid of a couple of cannons, and some stores of food that they hoped that they could replenish later. And they finally righted it and got it off at high tide. Now here's a curious episode of all the strange things that Drake did. The chaplain on board during this time preached a sermon on God's judgment. They were stuck on this reef because of their sins. And it's the just punishment of God that they are stuck on that reef. And Drake was not going to put up with that sort of sermon. Drake, of all things, he excommunicated the chaplain. How he thought he had the authority to do that, I guess when you're a captain at sea, you are next to God, and you have the power to do just about anything. So he excommunicated him and chained him by the leg to the mast for some time. And this armband is a real good one here. Francis Fletcher, falsest knave that liveth. But for the home crowd, all of your sins can be forgiven if you come back a hero with treasure. And he did. He arrived back at Plymouth. It was a 3-year trip. This is where Queen Elizabeth knights him on his ship. And get this, if you're an investor, and this was a commercial enterprise, make no doubt about that, a 4,700% return on your investment is not bad. And the Golden Hind becomes a tourist attraction for the next 100 years. People would come and see this famous ship that traveled around the world and brought back the riches of the East. And since it was not very well guarded, it was something that was there in the harbor and people could just come and go as they pleased pretty much. And they would take things off of the ship and they would carve things off of the ship. And after so many years, it was just a wreck before they finally got rid of it. And here is Queen Elizabeth knighting Francis Drake. And so now Drake is not only wealthy, he is a gentleman. And so he buys a house, which is really a converted abbey. Henry VIII had gotten rid of, in becoming Protestant, Henry VIII plundered the monasteries, the abbeys, and sold them to the highest bidders and to his friends. And so there is this abbey in that nearby Plymouth that Drake buys. He becomes the mayor of Plymouth, and he's elected to Parliament. He is a great hero. He's the guy that everybody wants to come and see. He's the rock star, the movie star that everybody gawks at. And here is his humble abode that he bought. Buckland Abbey, very nice little cottage in the country. And so for the next few years, Drake lives his life as a gentleman of leisure, but always, since he is an active sort of person, he was not the type that would just lay around and eat bonbons. He was, as I say, he was the mayor of Plymouth, elected to Parliament, always involved in politics. 1585, the Cold War is heating up with King Philip. And by the way, King Philip of Spain at this point is now also the King of Portugal. Portugal and Spain have united because of, there was a death of the previous King of Portugal, and King Philip was the next in line because of the various marriages and intermarriages of the royals of the day. That kind of thing could happen. And so now King Philip not only controls the Spanish Empire, he also controls the Portuguese Empire, which was considerable. So he's even more dangerous than he was before, bringing in more treasure, building up his navy. It was an ominous sign that had to be answered. As I say, he also owned territories in the Low Countries. What is now Belgium was in his control. The Netherlands, not so much, because they were Protestant. And so the Netherlands were fighting this ongoing war against King Philip, in which Queen Elizabeth, of course, wanted to help these the Dutch in their contest against King Philip. And so she didn't generally send soldiers, but she would send money and occasionally some ships to help them out. So, King Philip, in upping the ante, he decides he's going to seize all the British shipping, the merchant vessels that he can in Spain. And so Queen Elizabeth calls on Drake to lead a raid to the Indies, to the West Indies, and punish King Philip. First he goes to Vigo, Spain, and on his way out, he just missed, they say by 12 hours, he missed the treasure fleet coming back to Spain. And here's the West Indies. And he's going to attack. Anyway, if you are at all familiar, some people are, some people aren't, of course. The West Indies, you have the northern end of South America, you have Cuba, you have Haiti, and Central America here. So at this point, he goes up and he's heading towards the colony of Roanoke that has been established by the British. On his way up, he burns St. Augustine, which is really just a small little village that is used by the treasure fleets to resupply and get water and stuff. He goes up and comes to Roanoke. Now, many of you know about Roanoke and the lost colony. What many people forget is that there were 2 Roanoke colony sets. So this one was the first one. This is not the lost colony. The first attempt at a colony in Roanoke was set up, and Drake gets there, and he plans on leaving them one of his ships and some supplies. And then a storm hit and wrecked some of these ships, and then the colonists at this point elect to go back to England because they're not going to be resupplied by Drake anyway. That was the first Roanoke colony. And there's Roanoke. How many of you have visited Roanoke as a tourist? Very good, very good. So he returns to England. He didn't get a lot of the treasure that he was hoping. He missed the treasure fleet. He missed out on capturing other treasures in Latin America. And interestingly, Elizabeth, being very cautious in her foreign policy, she disowns Drake. When King Philip protests violently that this outrage, that this pirate, Drake, and by the way, he was known as Draco, the dragon, because that's the original meaning of Drake. It actually has 2 meanings. If you look this up, it could mean dragon, or it could mean just a male duck. And if you have the last name of Drake, I think you'd prefer the former. But King Philip was outraged, and so Queen Elizabeth, not wanting an open war, disowns Drake publicly, though privately everybody knows she doesn't mean it. And the investors, the London investors at this time, are a bit disappointed. They take somewhat of a loss. But if you made 4,700% investment on one expedition, I think you can take a small loss on the next. So everybody knows that the war fever is building. King Philip is preparing more and more, building more ships, gaining more supplies, and it's only a matter of time that he's going to invade or attack England. So Drake and the other war council members are trying to impress upon Elizabeth the importance of a preemptive attack. For Drake, the first line of defense, and he would say this emphatically, the first line of defense is the enemy's coastline, not ours. If we know he is preparing to attack us, we go after him first. Elizabeth was reluctant. She was not wanting to do this, but she decided that this was the best policy. And so she sends Drake on a preemptive attack. So he goes down and attacks Cadiz, which is the southern part of Spain. And it is wonderfully successful. And another thing too about the day in which we're talking, the ships that Drake used, this is kind of what we call now a public-private venture. Queen Elizabeth would put up some of the money and some of her ships. Drake would put in his own money and his own ships. The London merchants would put up money for ships and supplies and sailors. So it was not like the Queen of England or the government of Great Britain doing this expedition, or any of them for that matter. It was always at least somewhat privately funded. And the London merchants were very insistent that they had a part of this because they knew that they would get the profits too. So this is Cadiz, Spain, right near Gibraltar. And here's Cadiz Harbor. You'll notice that there is an outer harbor and an inner. King Philip is preparing for war. He's building ships more and more. He's trying to build up his military to the point where he can invade England. Cadiz Harbor is only one among several in which these ships are being built and held, but it was one of the major ones. And so Drake comes down, and they were not prepared for Drake, especially the skill with which he could attack. Someone described it like wolves in a sheepfold. He comes down with his ships, and he's the type of guy who's wanting to attack right away. Some of his commanders underneath him are saying, look, let's get prepared first. We're here, we see the ships, let's prepare ourselves and make the right plans, and then we can attack more effectively. Drake says, no, we're here. They see that we are here. We need to attack now. And so he did, plunging his ships right into the harbor and attacking at will. And like I said, wolves in a sheepfold. He attacked. And some of the ships were able to escape into the inner harbor under the guns of the local fort and were protected there. But he was able to burn 24 ships. And these are ships of the line battleships. Very important to the cause, and he took 6 others. Afterwards, he attacks Sagres Castle, just down the way a little bit. And then going up and down the coast, and this is kind of the interesting thing about this whole raid. He could take, as I say, he could take whatever he wanted out at sea. And he came across a number of ships that were cargo ships carrying staves. How many of you know what a stave is for? Yeah, it's you make them barrels from them. A very innocuous sort of thing. And historians will tell you that that was probably the most important thing that Drake did in this expedition. He burned tons of staves to make barrels. Staves are not just sticks of wood. They are carefully made. They have to be seasoned over a certain amount of time and crafted by real craftsmen. So when he burned these tons of staves, it was a great loss, the greatest loss to King Philip's enterprise. But where he made his money, of course, was with the treasure ships, and he captured one. Here's another type of ship, the carrack. This was the cargo ship of the day, and it was coming back from the East Indies with all kinds of treasures. And I kind of find it interesting that calico was considered very valuable. I mean, I don't know much about clothing and fabrics and stuff, but anyway, calico was one of the very valuable items on this ship. Of course, silk, indigo. We know what indigo is for, right? For dyes, yes. Pepper, which is very valuable, and a casket of jewels, just for fun. And here's a carrack, the cargo ship of the day, and barrel staves. Of all the things that you'd think would be important, this was the most important thing that Drake did, was burn these staves. But that did not stop Philip. It delayed him for about a year. He was planning on invading in 1587, but Drake made him postpone his plans. And so the following year, 1588, he gets together, roughly speaking, about 130 ships, galleys, galleons, galleasses, and a lot of transport ships for the soldiers. He had 30,000 troops and thousands of horses, heavy cannons. One of the problems with the Spanish style of ships, as opposed to the British, was that they would ride high in the seas. One of the myths about this whole event was that the British ships were smaller and thus more maneuverable. The British ships were not smaller. They looked smaller because they didn't ride so high. And they were often more sleek and elongated, and they were much more maneuverable. So, as far as the weaponry, there's a lot of technical terms that I'm not going to get into. I see a big cannon sticking out of the side of a ship, and I call it a cannon. There were other names that mariners of the day would call them. There were the cannons, there were the culverins, and a host of other names. I call them all cannons just because. It's a lot easier. The difference between how the Spanish outfitted their ships and the British was that the Spanish had lots of cannons. This was kind of a new thing too. They actually learned from Drake, because Drake's ships, or I should really say the British ships outfitted a lot of cannons in their ships, and Spain learned the lesson. Previously, the Spanish method of warfare out on the high seas was they would ride up to a ship and try to board it. And they had galleys that had oars. So their galley ships, they would believe, would be more maneuverable because they had these oars that they could move even when the wind wasn't blowing. The problem is that now that the British have ships with lots of cannons, you're not going to get anywhere near them. So that was the end of the galley as a warship. One of the emphasis that the British had also in their cannons, their culverins, they were long range. They emphasized hitting something at upwards of 500 to 700 yards. The Spanish emphasized the shorter, more powerful cannons that could really blast away at a ship, but weren't much good at anything past a couple hundred yards. So, here's a Spanish galley with all of the oars that there were only a few, and Spain was learning the lesson at this point, that the galleys were on their way out, so they didn't bring too many of them. None of them made it into action in the battle. Then you have the Spanish galleon, rode very high in the water and not very maneuverable. And here's a really awesome picture of the Armada. This is what the British would see coming toward them. So here's the plan. You sail through the English Channel to Calais, which is the northern coast of France. You meet with the Duke of Parma, who is fighting for the Spanish against the heretics in the Netherlands. They're going to pick up additional troops, and then at that point they were going to cross the channel and invade England. They thought it was something that was irresistible. They were going to pull it off, and England was no longer going to be a problem. The problem, of course, was that in those days, it was nearly impossible to pull off a plan like this, even if there were no opposition. Outfitting over 100 ships, provisioning thousands of soldiers and sailors and horses, and traveling that far, that in and of itself was very difficult. If you have opposition, it's even more difficult. What made it nearly impossible was the Dutch fighting against the Duke of Parma, that made it really impossible for the Duke to supply the Armada. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the British know this is coming. They are preparing as well. They have 102 ships with some in reserve. Lord Admiral Howard, who was telling me about Howard? There. He was in charge. And this came as a surprise to a lot of people, because who's the most famous mariner of the day? That is Drake. So a number of people are thinking, Drake is going to be very upset at this. He isn't going to stand for being second in charge. He actually took it very well, especially since Howard was very deferential to him and let him lead in a lot of ways. Both sides had trouble supplying themselves with gunpowder and shot for the cannons. Gunpowder in those days was very expensive, and the cannon balls are not cheap either, and usually not very well made. But they had a supply, and they were preparing to go. Now, England, even though they had the advantage of the home turf, as it were, still had a lot of difficulties as well, supplying ships for men who were sitting on board and at the ready for months on end, because they didn't know when exactly the Armada was going to land or come up the coast. And so it was very expensive. Queen Elizabeth, to her credit, was very tight-fisted with her money. She was not a spendthrift. On the negative side, the Navy was always short of supplies. And so the men had a very difficult time getting the food that they were supposed to have. So anyway, and being everything back in those days would, to us, be very primitive. The supply system, getting food to men, to thousands of men, is not an easy thing. It's near impossible back in these days. British weaponry. The galleons, galleasses, pinnaces, they were lower in the water, more streamlined and easier to maneuver. And as I said before, the cannons and the culverins, they had an emphasis on long-range shooting. July 19th. This was a new one on me too. How many of you know in England what the lizard is? Nobody?
I lived down in
Oh.
Cornwall.
What's
It's the tip of Cornwall.
Yes,
Yeah.
the tip of
It's
Cornwall.
a rugged part of the coast.
Yes. Until I was reading about the Armada, I had never heard that term before. Cornwall, that peninsula that sticks out at the southern end of Great Britain, is called the Lizard. And I looked that up to see, well, why in the world would it be called the Lizard? Maybe it's because it looks like a lizard. But would they even know that on the day back in the days when there was no aerial view? It turns out it's an old Welsh term that had nothing to do with a lizard. So anyway, so July 19th, the Armada was spotted off the coast of the Lizard. And so the plan for the British was to cross in front of the Armada and get around behind them. In that way, you have the windward side. The wind is coming towards, or from your back, towards the Armada. And once they did that, and that was not an easy thing to do, that's a very tricky maneuver, they pulled off in the nighttime, and they got behind the Armada. The Armada is in a crescent formation to protect the transports that are in the center. And there's the crescent formation that the Armada is in. And so the British are now pursuing them. Their strategy is to keep their distance, fire and flee, go round and round, and keep the Spanish from closing and try to break up the formation. If you can break up this formation, they become totally disorganized and can't carry out their own plans. Many, many shots are fired on both sides. Both sides are amazed at how much they are firing their cannons and nothing is happening. The Spanish can't reach the British ships, and the British, knowing that they can reach the Spanish ships, are now realizing that at that distance they can't do any damage to the Spanish ships. The velocity decreases tremendously at the range of 500 to 700 yards, if you can hit the ship at all. And that was a really tricky thing. A moving target shooting another moving target, when you're shooting something that doesn't even have a sight to it. They fired and fired and fired thousands and thousands of rounds. Most of them hit the water. The very few that did hit ships, the Spanish ships, oftentimes did not do much damage. Sometimes just bounced right off the sides. The damage that they did do was easily repaired, for the most part. Drake got lucky and captured one of the flagships of a particular squadron, but that was a ship that was already disabled. So the Armada reached Calais with very little trouble, really. The trouble, of course, was once they did reach it, the British plan was to send fire ships. The scariest thing you can do to a mariner is to send fire ships to the harbor of hundreds of ships, or many, many ships, all crowded together.
Alexander the Great introduced that
Did he?
tactic.
Yeah, very good. So the British, they wanted to do this, and they had to do it quickly. So they just gathered together a few ships. They only had 8 ships that they did it with. They fired them up. They took off the equipment and stuff, but they left all the cannons on these ships, and they loaded them up with double shots. And they fired them up, and they reached, when the Spanish saw them, they went into a panic. Like I said, this is one of the scariest things for a sailor to see, because ships are very, very flammable. As it turns out, the fire ships never burned any Spanish ships, but they did their work, because the Spanish fled out of the harbor and scattered in the channel and up and down the coast. Later on, when they finally got themselves together, they were terribly disorganized. And they went to around the area of Grave Lines, which is just down the coast a little bit from Calais. There's a picture of the fire ships. And here's Calais, here's Grave Lines, there's Dunkirk, famous site. And at this point, the mission is in great peril, but what really did it to them was the Duke of Parma at this point realizes he can't do anything to supply them. The Dutch are there harassing him constantly, and he has no ability to get his soldiers or supplies in their transport vessels out to the Armada. So the whole thing is scrapped. The Duke of Parma can do nothing. And so the Armada still has the problem of the British coming at them. They attack, and this is where the British have finally learned that they need to get closer in to do any damage. And so they did. They were running low on ammunition, however, both sides were, and so there weren't a lot of ships either taken or damaged, but the damage was done as far as wrecking the plans of the Spanish Armada. They chased them up north because that's the prevailing winds. They weren't going to go the opposite direction. The Spanish had become somewhat disorganized. They were almost completely out of ammunition, and now they had to escape. They came very close to being totally wrecked on the beaches until the winds changed direction. They escaped up north, past and over Scotland. But on the way, they were in such dire straits that often they had to land on the coasts, and at that point they would be butchered, whether by the Scots or even the Irish, who should have been on their side, being Catholics, but even the Irish generally would just attack them and butcher them. So in total, they lost about 64 ships and 10,000 men. Here's the route, all the way around and back down. Now you know about the Spanish Armada. You may not know about the British Armada, which happened just the following year. Thinking that they need to follow up on their success and destroy the remnant of the Spanish Armada, Queen Elizabeth, at the behest of the admirals, the British Admiralty, sent an expedition to destroy what was left. Fortunately, it was not a complete disaster. And that's about the best you can say of this, because it did not succeed in the way that it was supposed to. 150 ships, 20,000 soldiers led by Drake. They really couldn't do what they wanted to do and capture Lisbon and destroy the ships. And of course, many of the men get sick and died. Drake, after a few years being again the country gentleman, goes back. The Queen has another task for him with John Hawkins. The two of them go out to the West Indies again to do some plundering. But by this time, the magic had gone, along with his luck. And the Spanish were much more prepared. It was much more difficult. It was not easy pickings like it used to be. And so the Spanish were well prepared, and just everything seemed to go wrong. In the end, both Hawkins and Drake died of fevers on this expedition. Any questions, comments?
What are you going to forget next week?
Next week?
No, for this one.
Huh?
What are you going to forget that you're going to tell us next week?
Oh, I totally forgot. Well, I'll think of something. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Oh, one other thing. Let me.